The challenge of vaccine acceptance, which was true then, has only intensified over the ensuing decades. Subsequent, the big scares about childhood immunization, which were groundless, have morphed into generic worries about vaccines, which again have no scientific foundation, but which have a hold on people even today.
You're listening to A Second Opinion, your trusted source engaging at the intersection of policy, medicine, and innovation, and rethinking American health. Dr. Harvey Feinberg is president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. He previously served as president of the U.S. Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, as provost of Harvard University, and as dean of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Our wide-ranging discussion today hits on so many topics, including the role of foundations in impacting health, his research on the controversial 1976 federal immunization program against swine flu and its applications today, and how we should reform American medical education. All this is a discussion you don't want to miss. I'm your host, Senator Bill Frist. Welcome to A Second Opinion. Harvey, you currently serve as president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So why don't we start there? But let me just add right up front that prior to being at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, you served as president of the U.S. Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine. You've been provost of Harvard University. You've been dean of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. You've worn so many impactful hats in the healthcare space. But let's just talk about your work today at the foundation, and assume that I know nothing and our listeners know nothing, but start with the mission of the foundation, and then a little bit about the size and the reach and the impact. And then let's talk about some of the specific programs that are underway.
Well, thank you, Bill. I just want to say what a pleasure and privilege it is to have this opportunity to speak with you and to chat about these topics, and especially want you to know how much I have admired over the years your leadership and accomplishments for the nation and for health. I've had the privilege myself now to be at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation as its president since the beginning of 2015. The foundation was established about 20 years ago. Its main mission is to make things better for the future. It's a very broad vision of what to do. We have 4 areas in which we work. The 2 biggest ones are basic science and environmental conservation. We have a smaller program in patient care, and we have also a program we call the Bay Area program, which is where we are situated in California. And that program is dedicated to preserving the special character of the Bay Area. And it tends to emphasize in the Bay Area local expressions of our larger ambitions. And in particular, we support local science museums for informal science education. And we also engage in conservation in the greater Bay Area region. The foundation derives from the fortune of Gordon Moore, who was one of the founders of the Intel Corporation. Gordon is well recognized for Moore's Law. Yeah. Moore's Law came out of a paper he wrote in 1965. That predicted that the density of transistors on computer chips would double about every 18 to 24 months. He used to joke that he once looked it up on the internet and there were more references to Moore's Law than to Murphy's Law. And so he thought that was a great recognition. Yeah. But he never used that term. Others applied it, and it stood up as a prediction that has borne out for now more than half a century. So quite amazing. Yeah. The foundation currently has about $9 billion in assets. We support programs around the world, particularly in our environmental conservation program. Our science program also is global, but mainly concentrated in the United States. Our patient care program is specifically in the US. It started with a great emphasis on nursing, which grew out of Mrs. Moore's experience in a hospital. And you'll relate to this, Bill.
Yeah.
She was in a hospital bed and received an injection of insulin intended for the next patient in the bed adjacent. And typical of the Moores, instead of figuring out how to sue the hospital, they figured out how to improve performance of quality, especially with respect to nursing. And among other benefactions, started a nursing school at UC Davis, which is the Betty Irene Moore School of Nursing. And we still support a national leadership training program through that school today. So it's quite an enterprise, Bill. You asked me some of the most exciting things that we're doing. I would say what I love about this foundation and the opportunity is, first, it takes a strategic approach to everything it does. So, for example, we've invested in the environment in the Amazon region for conservation of the rainforest and preservation of these vital ecosystems for more than 15 years. We stay with it until we think we've done as much as we can do to get it to a point that it is successful. Mr. Moore once said his goal is not to lose more slowly, it's to win in the environment. And we strive to do that. We also have marine conservation programs and a very interesting investment in what we call the drivers of degradation of the environment to reduce the pressures, particularly that come out of some production of products like soy, cattle, shrimp, and other products that can be produced in environmentally sound ways or in environmentally detrimental ways. And we're trying to move that needle toward the successful sound ways of production. In the sciences, we have a fantastic set of programs, Bill, that cover basic physics. We have a program on what we call emergent properties in quantum systems. It's basically how those electrons dance around under special circumstances. We have another program on symbiosis in biology. But the things that I almost confess I enjoy the most are some of the one-off scientific efforts where we as a foundation can invest in things that are too weird and wild for the National Science Foundation or the NIH to touch, but if they work, would be just incredible. So we've got a group working on what's called accelerator on a chip, where we're trying to get, electrons accelerated up to the speed of light, but in the space of a couple of meters, instead of looking at building ever bigger kinds of accelerators that are just unaffordable. And we've got another group working on symbiosis in biology, a very important biologic process, relates to evolution, relates to successive organisms. And altogether, the combination of looking at long-term strategic investments and being willing to pick up the immediate short-term questions is really exciting. And finally, just say, given our own interests in health and medicine, in that area, in addition to nursing, we are focused on diagnostic excellence. This is an area that is underattended, extremely important, and especially consequential when you make the wrong or delayed diagnosis or fail to communicate it correctly in areas like cardiovascular disease, cancers, and sepsis.
Talk a little bit about the role of foundations, like the Moore Foundation. You have been at literally the highest level of academics in health and well-being. You've been in the public sector, the private sector, the philanthropic world. How do you see the role of foundations? You and I work on foundations together. I am on the board of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I've been on the board of the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Moore Foundation. In our society today, as we're going through all of the the challenges with COVID, the pandemic, and the distrust in science, and it's a broad question. But the foundations of the size that we're talking about, I think the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is about the same size, maybe $12-13 billion. Kaiser's smaller; it's a different type of an operating foundation. But is there any generalization based on your broad experience that you'd like to share about the role of foundations in advancing, our humanity, science broadly, especially in the field of health?
Well, the foundation in its modern use really goes back about a century to the original investments of philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, establishing places where they could exert a positive influence on society through philanthropy. The United States is quite special, particularly given the combination of the generosity of individuals and a sense of civic responsibility, coupled with policies, especially around taxes, that encourages wealthy individuals to deploy their assets and use them for the public benefit through private foundations and other means. These entities, to me, are a fantastic resource for our nation, coupled with the strengths of industry and the strengths of government. It represents a third arm of investment and change. It was once observed that philanthropy is society's venture capital. And I think there's a lot to that concept. Philanthropies have the opportunity to make investments in areas that are not yet in the mainstream, to put money on people and institutions that have great promise, but not yet great prominence. And a foundation can move very quickly to deploy resources toward problems that government is not yet ready to move and industry has no incentive to actually face up to. So when you look in the health space, Bill, problems that we know that just are rife, you mentioned the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the tremendous investment over decades of that foundation, improving the quality of patient care on the one hand, but also now in recent years, especially working on improving the culture of health and the prevention of disease and working in the communities. Recently a paper from overseas talked about 3 beyonds in health: beyond quality to value, beyond hospital to community, and the notion of looking beyond health care to health. And I think the ideas of dealing with health, looking at where people live, and thinking about value, what we get for dollar invested, as beyond simply how good the quality is. Those are going to be really important points where philanthropy can move quickly. Philanthropy can move with precision. Philanthropy can mobilize now sufficient resources in the larger philanthropies to actually make a difference. And all you have to do, I think, is look at a place like the Gates Foundation in global health. I would say Robert Wood Johnson domestically is a great example, but you and I know that others like the Peterson Foundation, the Macy Foundation, many, many others are working on particular dimensions of health, including, most importantly today, inequities in healthcare. So I believe the philanthropic sector is really a vital adjunct to social progress, along with what we benefit from industrial and commercial progress, and where government has an irreplaceable role, but not able to do all the things that philanthropy can accomplish.
Talking and referring to that flexibility and immediacy, responsiveness, nimbleness of foundations, I have found it interesting. I'd love for you to sort of share your thoughts on it, of what a foundation has as its mission at a point in time. You mentioned, we talked about you decided 5, 6 different foundations. It started with one family or one person, and in their mind, they have a mission. Some, and you almost apologize for it up front, the mission of the Moore Foundation is very broad. What is the role of the board in setting that mission? And it may be generations later, it might be the next generation, it might be immediately. And what is the role of the CEO? And you can use an example of the Moore Foundation. You have 2 big buckets now with basic science and the climate. At what point was that actually determined in terms of the journey of the foundation and the trajectory of the foundation? A little bit about mission at a point in time of foundations.
Bill, let me comment a little generally and then come back specifically to the Moore experience. I think of foundations in their life cycle, if you think of it as an institutional life cycle, as going through a number of stages or generations. A first generation or first stage foundation to me is when the founders are still active and engaged and setting the tone, direction, purpose, and overall mission of the organization. A great example of that would be the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, where the founders continue to work along with Warren Buffett in setting that direction. Second generation is when, to me, individuals who knew and loved and cherished the founders are still active in the foundation, but the founders are no longer active. And that is a time when people begin to think about what is it that the founders wanted that we want to preserve, and what about the world is changing such that we as an organization now should adapt in different ways to what the world is demanding of a philanthropy with our overall scope and mission. And then there's a third generation where neither the founders nor those who knew the founders are still active in the organization. And that's where a board, in effect, is untethered from its origins. It's off and moving at sea on its own steam, and where that board then has to think back to the core values that motivate the organization. That board may select a leader for the purpose of helping it to reframe and to reshape and to renew its purpose and mission today. I honestly don't know if Henry Ford would recognize the Ford Foundation today, but the Ford Foundation has been and continues to be a vital source for doing good in the world, amplified over time by the success of its own generative powers, and a great example of a third generation, in my terms, of a foundation. So I think the roles of a board and the roles of the CEO actually evolve as the generations of the foundation's institutional maturation take place over time. Now, the Moore Foundation is in what I would call late first generation. Mr. Moore remains an active member of our board. He stepped down from the chairmanship. He was chair at the time I started, now 7 years ago. He stepped down a couple of years ago, and Paul Gray, a wonderful leader, is now chairing the foundation, but Mr. Moore, Gordon Moore, is active on the board. So I would describe us as a late first generation foundation. The programs of our foundation, the 2 main programs, really derive from the interests and passions of the founders. And that was part of what they developed in the very earliest days. Sometime, Bill, I hope you'll have a chance to visit us out in Palo Alto. And if you do, I'll take you to a place we call the collaboration space. And up on the wall behind some protective plexiglass are original whiteboard expressions of the ideas to animate the foundation from the beginning. And basic science is there, and environmental conservation is there. there's some things there that we don't do in that form any longer. Originally, they thought of higher ed as an area, but it kind of morphed into the science program. And the idea of patient care came a little later, growing out of Mrs. Moore's experience, as I described earlier. So that's the Moore Foundation, but more generically, I see the philanthropic world in generations relative to mission, responsibilities of the board, and roles of leadership.
It is so useful to hear, and really appreciate you taking time to explain it. I was trying to think back to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We have no family members, but we're in that sort of phase 2 to phase 3 because there are people on the board, and how many people it should be, nobody really has the answer, but who knew the general and reflect the very important principles that he articulated at the time and was a part of the company J&J. But the foundation is totally separate than the company. And so it's sort of in that phase 2 to 3, I think. And the Kaiser Family Foundation, we had a member of the Kaiser family, and it's not mandated, it's not in the bylaws, but on the board expressing that sort of interest. So I find it very, very useful for you to articulate that life cycle and the importance that they play over time. Let me come back to the conservation. I am on the board of the Nature Conservancy as well, which is another very, very, very large foundation that has shifted its focus pretty dramatically in the last 4 or 5 years since I've been on the board, from one that's centered around nature and people, mainly conservation, I think in a pretty nonpartisan way compared to a lot of foundations. It was sort of, right in the middle, a lot of bipartisanship and huge respect for that. And it shifted to where that center of gravity is still nature, but it's much more in the climate and the global changes that are affected by climate change. And I'm interested in the health end of that. Talk a little bit more. I know you said a little bit in our opening on the environmental conservation. Is it predominantly in the world of environment affecting health, or is it more in the conservation itself?
At the Moore Foundation, Bill, it's focusing on the conservation of the environment and the sustainable ecosystems, the importance of intact sustainable places for multiple species survival and so forth. In environment and human interaction, traditionally there was a big divide between those who worried, from the world of public health, for example, about the impact of the environment on humans, and then others who worried, mainly coming out of the conservation space, about the impact of humans on the environment. And I think what many people are coming to is to see these as both important and mutually reinforcing. The environment has many benefits for human populations, but also many hazards. We're in the middle of a pandemic, emerging as most emerging infections do, as a zoonotic infection. I know there's still an unproved origin of this coronavirus particularly, but emerging infections by and large come from the contact of wild animals to human population. That's a word of the zoonotic transmission from an animal to a human. In the question of climate, a growing body of attention to the impacts of climate disruption on human health and well-being. And this is moving beyond the concerns which we're all now experiencing of hurricane, flood, tornado, wildfire, into areas a little more subtle, like vectors that now have a wider range of spread and therefore can bring certain diseases to areas that previously were protected and now are vulnerable. and other ways in which heat and average changes in climate expressing as periods of more intense weather can lead to higher incidence of directly heat-related problems in places that experience those. Not to mention the problems of sea rise and impact on coastal areas and much more. So in brief, in the larger view, this cycle of interaction and relation between the environment and human population, important in both directions. For the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, our primary focus has been on conserving vital ecosystems in the environment.
I want to come back to so many of the topics we've talked about, but let me jump back about 30 or maybe longer. No, I guess about 40 or 45 years. And you've done extensive research and written books on a whole broad range of topics that that pertain to the challenges that we have today. And I know, because I know you personally and career-wise and professionally, you're always looking to the future, always looking to the future. But just going back and looking at the body of science and literature that you've contributed to, that you've facilitated, that you've mentored over time. And one that I just want to spend a little bit of time on from 50 years ago is the work, The Epidemic That Never Was. And that's an analysis of the controversial U.S. immunization program against swine flu back, I guess I was a sophomore in medical school, second year in medical school, back in 1976. And then in the opening of the book, you wrote, in the swine flu scare, the United States government tried to immunize its whole population against a threat of world epidemic from a potentially deathly and new influenza strain known as swine flu. And in the opening, you continue to write, the scale of the immunization effort was unprecedented, with more than 40 million citizens immunized in 10 weeks during the fall of 1976. The venture also was marked, not surprisingly, by controversy, delay, administrative troubles, legal complications, a threat of unforeseen medical side effects, and a progressive loss of credibility for public health authorities. Now, I know I said 1976, so most of our listeners, many of our listeners may not have even been alive then, but those words could be applied to today. Describe for us a bit, sort of, not so much about what was going on then, but reflect on that, but then what takeaways we might have from that experience and apply to today.
Bill, we've often heard when we talk about our current COVID experience that it's the worst pandemic in a century. And the reason we say that is that the 1918-19 influenza pandemic was the greatest calamity in recorded modern time from a natural disease. And that's relevant to the 1976, because although in 1918-19 viruses were not yet discovered, that came in the 1930s, and we didn't have a clue at that time exactly what was causing that great pandemic of 18-19. Ultimately, that was shown to have been a form of influenza that was characterized as a swine influenza. And in influenza, the main characterization is about two proteins that are on the surface of the virus. And this one had the characteristic of the swine flu. Now, what happened in 1976 was that a couple of soldiers got sick at Fort Dix. It's in New Jersey. And turned out that the health officer at the base had a little bet going with the state health officer what caused their illness. And they sent off to the lab specimens to figure out what it was. And to their amazement, they couldn't isolate. They could say it was influenza, but not the type. So they sent it to the CDC in Atlanta. And sure enough, the CDC said, oh my gosh, this is a swine flu type. And one of those soldiers, the 4 soldiers initially diagnosed, actually went on a very active forced march, got very sick and died. So this sent off tremendous alarm bells because a lot of the experts of influenza at that time actually had a theory about the recycling of different forms of influenza. And they had predicted we're about due for swine flu to come back. And sure enough, there it was. So the CDC sent the alarm up the channels. It got to then President Ford, and the US launched a program to make this vaccine and immunize every adult American against threat of swine flu. Now, what happened over the ensuing months, they couldn't find any more influenza cases, not in the Northern Hemisphere and not in the Southern Hemisphere, which often is a place that has the kind of influenza that, their winter is our summer. And so you can track what's happened in the world. Anyway, to make a long story a bit shorter, the program ran into legal troubles. It was the manufacturers said, we're not going to produce this vaccine because of lawsuits. And they weren't worried about the vaccine being bad. They were just worried about people claiming it was bad and that they'd have to defend themselves. So they said, we have to be indemnified. The Congress wasn't ready to do that until coincidentally Legionnaire's disease, which you may remember in Philadelphia, broke out. People said, oh my gosh, this could have been that flu. And what would we have done? And then the Congress said, okay, we'll indemnify. So they started producing the vaccine. And then in October, they finally started immunizing people. Not everybody came to get immunized. That's a familiar story. So they didn't get as many immunized as they desired. And then it turned out that there was a rare side effect called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an ascending form of paralysis. And that was reported as a potential association. It was checked out. There was a belief that it had been associated. We're talking like 1 out of a million immunizations. In any event, when there was no swine flu anywhere, that was enough to lead them to stop the program. Mm-hmm. I got involved the following January, February, when President Carter came in, appointed as his secretary of what was then called Health, Education, Welfare, now HHS, a guy named Joseph Califano. Mr. Califano's secretary turned to a senior colleague of mine named Dick Neustadt because he knew that Neustadt knew how to figure out what happened in these complicated political situations because of experience he'd had with a previous work that Neustadt had done. And Neustadt in turn enlisted me to work with him on this. I was his teaching assistant at the time. So that's how that report came about. But here's the key thing, which is still relevant to us today. Public health, now as then, has been grossly underinvested in. Secondly, public health is constantly navigating between the shoals of over-alarming and under-delivering. And in 1976, unfortunately, the CDC managed to do both of those things, over-alarmed and under-delivered. Mm-hmm. The challenge of vaccine acceptance, which was true then, has only intensified over the ensuing decades. Subsequent, the big scares about childhood immunization, which were groundless, have morphed into generic worries about vaccines, which again have no scientific foundation, but which have a hold on people even today. I think that we could look back and learn many things from our experience in the past, but we also, I believe, to be successful, Bill, in a situations such as COVID, there has to be a readiness to adapt to the circumstances as they evolve. And one of the things that I feel particularly importantly about is that when our leaders in health at the Centers for Disease Control, at the NIH, in any place of government, face changing circumstances, like there's a new Delta variant, or changing conditions in our response capacity, we have to adapt our strategy in order to be successful. So constancy in the face of change is no virtue. Adaptation to meet the challenge is what we need and what we ought to demand and expect from our leaders politically and in public health. But the main lessons of the underinvestment chronically in public health compound our nation's ability to respond today. And frankly, if we do not make the investments that are necessary over time, are going to impede our ability to respond to the next pandemic. And the next one will be there. It's going to come at some time, because that's the nature of those zoonotic transmissions.
Yeah, Harvey, so what in 2005, I wrote a lot because we'd come out of SARS. We had the experience with the HIV. We the whole bioterrorism, the bioterrorism threats at the time, and the inevitability of pandemics and of viruses coming again and again. And I thought that we would start funding public health. And I was majority leader. I ended up retiring that following year, but I thought for sure there was enough of a wake-up call. And here we're talking about 1976, and now I'm talking about 2005, and here we are in 2021. And it is that same problem that you start with, and that is the underfunding of public health, because as we always say, when the snake's not right at your foot and it's over in the bushes somewhere, you just don't pay attention to it. You've been an observer, a participant. You've been on the inside and the outside of our political government system. Is there anything that we can do this time around? And we've got thousands of people who are listening to us right now, that we can do differently to encourage more sustained funding for public health? Because as COVID sort of becomes a more normal type of virus in the sense of having a vaccine for it, we're all at risk of forgetting what we've just gone through. Is there anything that you can advise and that you're thinking about that we can keep a more sustained interest, affect our policymakers, our government, to take our taxpayer money and use it in a way that can make that next pandemic maybe not a pandemic, maybe just an epidemic going forward?
Bill, your mention of 2005, that was a time also of the bird flu scare, as you'll remember. And even that did not stimulate the attention. And in a way, maybe you could say, oh, well, that was an over-alarming situation, because actually that bird flu never did materialize as a major zoonotic human problem. It was a catastrophe for chickens and for ducks, but not for the human population.
Right.
Well, your question is really at the heart of the issue. The U.S. has so many advantages as a nation in the way we are structured, but our federal system also has certain handicaps. And one of those handicaps, which in our Constitution has never been fully resolved, is where does sovereignty reside? Is it in the individual states, or is it in the nation as a collective? And the Constitution is ambiguous about what aspects of sovereignty are a state residue, all other things remaining, and what part goes to the federal government. That is where our Supreme Court spends a lot of time every year sorting out for us on issue after issue after issue. And when it comes to a national crisis, an emergent situation such as a pandemic, the diversity, which is a source of strength in learning and activity, can become a source of sluggish, irregular, uncoordinated, and problematic response. And so figuring out a way where we can attain a degree of harmonization across states on program needs that are intrinsically national, in fact, global, is a really big fundamental challenge. Now, you put your finger on the main problem, which is resources and willingness to invest. I find it fascinating that young people are drawn to public health and global health in ways that are beyond anything in any previous generation. They want to make a difference. They see the needs. They want to contribute in this way in their lives. We need to make places in our local county, municipal, and rural health areas for this energy, talent, and commitment to express itself. And the only way to do that is to enable those units to rebuild, to reestablish themselves with the capacities. It starts, frankly, with a minimum standard of physical resources. What I would like to see, Bill, I'd love to see a national grading system for readiness of county health departments, in which you could rate and perform according to standards. Just like hospitals are accredited, you would have a county health department certified as prepared. And when that county did not meet the standard, it would be the responsibility of the local officials to figure out, well, what do we need to do? And then you'd get, over time, the degree of attention based on factual deficiency that would demand our investment for preparedness. You could argue, Bill, we underinvest in our schools. Well, we put a lot of money into education. We may not always use it optimally. We put a boatload of money into patient care after the fact of illness, but it's only what drops off the gunnels on the side that falls into public health ocean. And public health is the area where we should give the same attention to quality, the same demands of standards, and a level of investment commensurate with the needs. So anyhow,
I love your thought, and we'll continue it now that you've planted the seed with me of having a standard expectation report card of the ability to respond, and not being critical at all. It's a little bit like measuring schools. That everybody says that kids go to the very best schools, but if you really objectively measure schools, there's huge disparities that people aren't aware of. But once they're made aware of, they're willing to do those extra things or look for those levers and to pull to make them better. And you're exactly right. Local communities don't have it today, and that would be a great starting point. So we'll talk about that more. I'm not sure if we talked about it before, but in Nashville, we started a community collaborative called Nashville Health, and we had no idea exactly what it was going to do. But we knew we had this juxtaposition of a great healthcare town with corporate offices of great hospital chains and ambulatory surgical chains and high quality around the country. But our public health right here in Nashville was not as good as other comparable sister and brother type cities that we compete with for jobs all the time. So we started it. And one of the great benefits was in the room, we had what we were talking about earlier. We had the philanthropies, the nonprofits, about 130 nonprofits here in Nashville. We had the CEOs of the 5, 6, 7, 8 largest companies in Middle Tennessee. But most importantly, I think we had the leaders of our public health department. at the state level and at the local level. And it was the first time that they'd been in the room at the table with the most powerful community leaders, and political figures were there as well, or representatives of government. But in that room of 20 people, we had 4 public health professional career people. And they didn't know the CEOs, and they didn't know the government people, and the government people didn't know them. But to begin that dialogue and that importance that they play, whether it's our more traditional clean water and sanitation and environment, or things that we're going through today. So I just listening to you, there are things that can be done. And then lastly, when I was in Congress, over a 5-year period, we doubled funding for the NIH. Now, you're right in the middle of all of that, and recall it. I say that, the baseline wasn't big, but if there is a calling for increased funding in health and healthcare, and that's more basic science, but the government will respond. And by doing the sorts of things at the local level that you mentioned in terms of being able to diagnose how effective, how much resources are, can you respond quickly, and then to bring people in the community. The message to our listeners, I think, is that you can change funding at the global, at the national level in government. It can be done.
Well, Bill, what you're describing is simultaneously working at the local level up and from the national level down. And I think that combination is just the right way to build toward a healthier set of communities and healthier individuals. As individual clinicians, that the health of your patient depends a lot on what they experience at home and their family and their community. But our institutions of care are not set up with responsibility to extend to those communities. It gets back to those 3 beyonds, doesn't it?
I love them.
Beyond healthcare to health, beyond hospital to community, and beyond quality to value. And if we could push those principles out to communities in the way that you're doing in Nashville, what a difference we could make to the preparedness for pandemics, but more than that, to the health and well-being of people every day in their lives.
Harvey, let me switch a little bit, and again, thank you so much. What an opportunity for me and our listeners to be able to just have a conversation like this and touch upon things that at least I think about all the time, and I think our listeners will find interesting. And it takes me to another place that you spent 12, 13 years, and that's the Institute of Medicine. We talked a bit about what nonprofits, philanthropic organizations can do in terms of their nimbleness. But let's talk a little bit about the Institute of Medicine, now known as the National Academy of Medicine. You led it from 2002 to I think 2014. And during that time, I remember I was in the Senate till 2006 and followed closely then in the next 8 years the huge number of landmark reports that really did change the thinking on a whole range of issues in healthcare, and issues that were important at the time, historically important, but most importantly, issues of the time and the future. And one that I routinely come back to again today, and I had to pull off the shelf and go reread about a year ago, was one called Unequal Treatment. And that was back in 2003 while I was still in the Senate. And it demonstrated exactly what COVID is bringing out, the disproportionate impact that a virus, a pandemic has on people of color. And a 2003 report talked a lot about that virtually every therapeutic intervention, Blacks and other minorities received poorer quality care than whites. So take all of that as an introduction of your years at the Institute of Medicine, a couple of the reports you might mention that stick out in your mind, and anything about that report on entitled Unequal Treatment.
Bill, thank you. The Institute of Medicine, then the National Academy of Medicine now, is part of that family of organizations called the National Academies, the sciences, engineering, and medicine. They date back really to the Civil War, when the National Academy of Sciences was established for the express purpose of advising the US government on any matter of science or technology. They used the word art at that time, but it was what we would understand as technology today. And the Institute of Medicine, which started back in now 50 years ago, 1970, was set up for the purpose of applying that same set of advisory principles specifically in the domains of health and medicine. Interestingly, it was organized from the beginning with a broad representation of membership, not just physicians, but other health professionals, nurses especially, but pharmacists and other health professionals. It was set up with non-health professionals who were knowledgeable and expert in healthcare, so the social sciences especially, and legal aspects were also represented. The key thing about the Institute is that it both responded to requests from the Congress or from any agency of government for scientific assessment of this area, whatever the area might be. And it had the capacity as a separate body to undertake its own studies on topics that it determined would be important to the national well-being. Unequal treatment was one of the landmark studies that occurred early in the course of my term at the Institute of Medicine. It was important because it laid out in clear and unmistakable terms the evidence about disparities of access, of the consequences of those disparities, of the differences in treatment, of the ways in which especially minority populations, people of color, but also other disadvantaged populations in terms of income, or those who lived in areas that were harder to reach, all experienced deficiencies in care that were remediable, that could be made better by focusing attention on those problems. We had recently, I mentioned we were working on diagnostic excellence at the Moore Foundation. We had a recent set of reviews, and one of the participants in our expert panel was an individual who also had experienced diagnostic error on her part. And this was an African-American woman at a young age who experienced a cardiovascular event, and none of her clinicians initially could think it was a heart attack because she was young, she was a woman, she was African-American, she was slender, she didn't have any of the risk factors, but there it was. And so the way in which this problem can be fixed is through first recruiting, educating, and deploying more persons of color in the health professions. Secondly, educating all of us in the health professions about the reality of these disparities. Third, putting in place explicit programs that level the playing field and make it opportune for disadvantaged communities to get the same quality of care. And by the way, I would say the same quality exactly equals, not always equivalent. You know, if you've got 3 children and one is a 28-inch waist and one is a 30 and one's a 32, you don't give them all 30-inch belts. That's equal, but that's not sensible. So when you want to make it genuinely equal, you've got to size the belt to the problem or to the waist. And here it can require intensified attention to make it more nearly equal. And that's what we need to both recognize and put into practice. That was a message of that report, and I'm glad you made reference to it.
Yeah, I think that the whole discussion of disparities, which I think boardrooms are talking about, communities are talking about, chambers of commerce are talking about. It's interesting. Go back to that report and the disparities being documented there for the first time. Then the question is, now what? What do we do? And it has spilled over into, I think, a very healthy discussion in all of our communities, which shows the importance of doing those baseline reports like that. And then to have it substantiated again and again, and then to figure out the action items around that. So I think it's a great example of the importance of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy. And thanks so much for sharing that history with us as well. Another entity which, just like the philanthropic institutions and the Moore Foundation and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, has to go hand in hand working with other public and private sector entities to improve health and well-being. Again, there's so many things, and I know we got to wrap things up here, but let's talk a little bit about medical education. You've written so many, and I'll put all this in our notes that accompany our podcast, but you've written so many books and reports, but one of the books was called Innovators in Physician Education, and it's all about reforming medical education. We don't have to go back to the book itself, but where we are today, we've got technology advancing at a rate faster than Moore's Law, probably. We have team learning, we got virtual care, we have supercomputers, we have advancing science. Any comments on medical education system today in terms of reform?
Well, I think physician education in the United States is one of our great achievements over the last century in terms of the quality, uniformity, and caliber of education. You can be educated at any U.S. medical school. You will get a first-rate education. That dates back to, again, another early 20th century reform of so-called Flexnerian revolution after Abraham Flexner's report, which introduced a couple of key ideas on science as a basis for medical education, the teaching hospital as the place for learning, and university settings as the responsible academic entities. That so-called Flexnerian revolution led to a lot of change in some, most fly-by-night or apprentice-type programs just went by the wayside then. And over time, U.S. has developed very important standards, review procedures, and truly continued excellence in physician education. Today, however, we do face enormous challenges. The big challenge for medical professional education, in my mind, Bill, is preparing people not to practice when they graduate, but preparing people for a lifetime of professional growth and continued advancement in their ability to practice up to the standard as it advances over time. That means preparing students for lifelong learning. We're looking at a review of global professional education in medicine, nursing, and other health professions. And there are three big trends that are worth making special note about. The first of these is competency-based education goals. Instead of looking at what you've learned, you look at what you can do. And over time, increased emphasis on assuring professional competencies and what those mean over time is a very important movement. The second area is interprofessional learning. It's the importance of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and others working in concert to the care of patients. And that means not only doing it in a clinical setting, but learning about doing it in the course of training. And the third is technology-enhanced education. And this relates to everything from robotics to remote learning, to all sorts of ways in which technology is enhancing caliber of learning. And when you get to a movement such as telehealth, which has been so amplified and accelerated in the course of our COVID experience, it illustrates the ways in which the capacity to adapt, to use technology, to care for patients as individual humans and to recognize how to connect to people even when you're not physically in the same space. These are great illustrations of the ways in which medical and other health professional education has to adapt and redeploy and strengthen a lifelong learning concept for all of us in the health professions.
Harvey, you've had 20 different careers. I'm just making up a number in terms of how much you continue to do. But if you just look back, and we've touched on 3 or 4 of them today, is there any, what advice would you give? Or is there something that you wish when you were 24, 25 years of age that you know now that you wish you had known back then? I'm thinking of a lot of people who tune into our show are people maybe in medical school, maybe starting a small business in the health and well-being field. Some people are policymakers or want to have a career and go into policy and do many of the sorts of things that you have done. Anything for that group of people who are 20 to 30 years of age, looking to the future based on your sort of rich and varied series of careers that you've done?
Well, I've had the great privilege, Bill, of being able to do things that I loved doing and somehow earning a living at it while I was doing it. I think that if you start with something, if you have the privilege of starting with something you love and you can stay with that as your guide star, to me, that is the number one lesson I would say that I've learned. I would say, secondly, for me, looking to what you're doing now, both to do as well as you can for what it is, but always looking to learn about something you don't yet have any mastery of and want to learn more about, and maybe have a chance to do something more in that area. And that also implies not being afraid to take a few risks on yourself, stretch a little, try something that you feel strongly about, but maybe you're not as sure that you can do it. And I think that sometimes people are reluctant to take up something because they don't feel they've completely mastered everything they need to do it. And my advice is, if you're passionate about it and you have the right attitude, which is a student-servant attitude, you will master what you need to master. So go for it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that's how I think of it.
Yeah, and I was reading this past weekend, Joseph Campbell, who, as you know, is a great scholar, but a lot of practical things in terms of myths and goes back to Greek mythology and the myths over time, but talking a little bit about chasms. And it goes back to some of the Native American philosophy. When you come to a chasm, evolution just teaches you, well, I'm not going to jump that chasm. But in truth, as people age and look back, they point to those chasms. They did just muster that little bit of courage to jump. It's part of the hero's journey that Campbell talks about, but I think it's really consistent with what you said about being able to take, if you're in almost a privileged position sometimes to do it, be able to take that risk. Any books, anything you're reading that as I know we're going to wrap things up now, but anything you've read recently that you'd like to share?
There's one maybe that I would like to share. It's a book called Noise. And it's written by Daniel Kahneman and Olivier Sibony and Cass Sunstein. And the premise of this book is all about avoiding errors. And Kahneman, is a very famous psychologist who actually won a Nobel Prize in economics because of the work he did that undergirded behavioral economics. Most of his professional work was on biases, sources of bias. reasons that we make mistakes because we are anchoring in something that is not correct, or we rely on ways of thinking that don't really lead us to a correct answer. But here they make a very important point, which is errors come both from bias, which is being off target, and from scatter, which is like being around a target. If you think about a bullseye, Bill, if you clustered 5 shots in the upper left corner, those would be biased up to the left, but they would be consistent. And if you scattered 5 shots around the bullseye, they would be on average accurate, but they're scattered. And the point of this book is both of these sources of error, bias and variability, which they call noise, are equally important contributors to being off the mark. And I thought it was a brilliant work, very well written, and I learned from it a great deal.
Okay, that's a good one. I have not read that, so that's a good one for me to take as well, and I'll share with you my thoughts next time we are together. Harvey, you've been so generous with your time today, and I've learned a lot, and I know that our listeners and our viewers have. But let me just close by thanking you for your ongoing service at the Moore Foundation, where you're planting lots of seeds and being innovative and so many exciting fields, and your past contributions, which I think that as we wrap things up, it's clear to our listeners and our viewers that all these past things, even back in 1976, come back again and again and again, and that we learn from them, and that what we learn needs to be applied, and we need to study history, and we need to look to the past as we look to the future. I say all that out of deep respect for everything that you continue to do. Dr. Harvey Feinberg, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure.
This episode of A Second Opinion was produced by Todd Schlosser and Invenium Creative Strategies. You can subscribe to A Second Opinion on Apple Podcast or wherever you are listening right now. And be sure to rate and review A Second Opinion so we can continue to bring you great content. You can get more information about the show, its guests and sponsors at asecondopinionpodcast.com. A Second Opinion broadcast from Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, the nation's premier ecosystem of health services, where we engage at the intersection of policy, medicine, and innovation.